Our
Staying cool.
staying cool at City Hall, the annex building was without power twice today.
Ooh, ouch.
But City Hall has remained with power.
There's
Now
a
this heat.
generator, right?
What's that?
There's a generator.
There is a generator in case we need it, yes.
My poor pansies, they were like,
It kept bouncing me off the
There you are.
line here.
All right. Do you have power, Yolanda?
Yeah, I just got it also.
Just got it on too.
A
Yep.
little while
No, you
ago.
would be, or else
Yeah.
you wouldn't be on. Yeah.
I was heading to City Hall because I had a meeting with the mayor, and then all of a sudden it just goes boop. Didn't have any internet up here, so.
Council, I have started the recording.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Okay, we'll just give it, we'll give it just one more minute here, and maybe others may be without power.
I believe Councilmember Brown just joined, Deputy Mayor.
Okay, good. All right.
It does appear everybody is present.
Okay, great. All right, we will go ahead and call this meeting to order. So everybody welcome to the City Council study session for June 28th, 2021. And per Governor Inslee's emergency proclamation 20-05 and 20-28, and stay safe, stay healthy. The City of Auburn is prohibited from holding in-person meetings at this time. City of Auburn Resolution 5581 designates the City of Auburn meeting locations for our regular special study session meetings of the City Council and all committees, boards, and commissions. But the city is virtual until Washington governor authorizes local governments to conduct in-person meetings really soon. So this hopefully will be the last time that I have to say this, as we may be getting back to our regular roles. Not yet.
Not for a while, Deputy Mayor. Sorry to
Thank
burst
you.
that bubble, but we will.
Thank you, Mayor.
remote for a
Okay.
while.
So we will continue on with our little screens here virtually until the mayor says it's okay to go. And with that, Sean, will you please call roll?
Deputy Mayor DeCoursey,
Here.
Councilmember Baggett,
Here.
Councilmember Brown, Councilmember Brown, I'll come back to him. Councilmember Dayraj,
I'm here.
Councilmember Malinga,
Here.
Councilmember Stern,
Here.
and Councilmember Trump Manuel.
Here.
And Councilmember Brown, are you available now? He is rejoining, so
Okay. So as we, I don't believe we have any announcements, reports, or presentations this evening.
no, Chair.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to our agenda items for council discussion this evening. And the first item on the agenda is Resolution 5598 with Director Tate.
Good evening, Deputy Mayor, City Council, and Mayor. This evening, I'd like to introduce Matt Gehring. Matt, I'll give Matt a second to activate his video and his audio here. Matt is the Salmon Recovery Manager who oversees the Green Duwamish and Central Puget Sound watershed, which we commonly refer to as RIA 9. Tonight, Matt is going to provide a presentation on the 2021 Salmon Habitat Recovery Plan for the Green Duwamish watershed. I'd also, just before turning it over to Matt, would like to acknowledge or call out Councilmember Stern's participation in this effort, in the salmon recovery planning efforts that we work on in the Green Duwamish. Councilmember Stearns sits on the Watershed Ecosystem Forum. He's the Auburn's elected representative. And the Watershed Ecosystem Forum, as well as Ryan 9, is really a group of 17 municipalities that work on and share the Green Duwamish watershed and the salmon recovery objectives, responsibilities, and priorities that we work on in the region. So I'll turn it over to Matt to take over for presentation. I think it says on the agenda that Matt will have about 25 minutes or so, and I know that there'll be time at the end for questions and answers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Hello, can everyone hear me all right and see my screen? All right,
Yes, we can.
great. Well, good afternoon, Mayor, members of council, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about salmon recovery efforts in the Green Duwamish and Central Puget Sound, including the recent Raya 9 Salmon Habitat Plan update. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Matt Goring. I'm the Salmon Recovery Manager for Raya 9, and I'm excited to be here today to update you on our collective efforts in this watershed. So Puget Sound Chinook have experienced a sustained decline over the last 150 years. The image on the right traces that population decline since the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad. The decline culminated in 1999 with the listing of Puget Sound Chinook under the Endangered Species Act. In response to the listing, the state created a structure for local watershed-based organizations to provide the backbone of salmon recovery efforts across the state. These organizations, such as Raya 9, help bring diverse interests and parties together to build local support for salmon recovery. In 2001, the 17 local governments in the watershed came together and entered into an interlocal agreement to support salmon recovery efforts. The ILA recognized that the salmon life cycle takes them across jurisdictional boundaries, and ultimately recovery depends on a collective commitment across the watershed. The Raya 9 partnership both supports a powerful collective voice for salmon recovery in the watershed and also provides a cost share structure that provides a unique, sustainable source of funding for ongoing recovery efforts. The Raya 9 partnership developed its first recovery plan in 2005. That plan was subsequently ratified by all 17 local governments, and that plan served as the blueprint for salmon recovery in our watershed for the last 15 years. So Raya 9 salmon recovery really is nested within a larger picture. Green River Chinook are one of 22 individual populations within Puget Sound. Other nearby populations include the Cedar River and the Puyallup River to the south. The Raya 9 watershed plan is considered just one local chapter of the larger Puget Sound Chinook recovery plan. And at even larger scale, Puget Sound recovery efforts are just one component of the Puget Sound recovery efforts as captured under the action agenda of the Puget Sound Partnership. So as you guys all know, Raya 9 is a diverse landscape. The watershed spans about 575 square miles, ranging from the industrial Duwamish waterfront all the way up to U.S. Forest Service lands along the crest of the Cascade Mountains. The watershed-based model allows us to take a holistic approach to identifying limiting factors and prioritizing those projects that we expect to provide the largest benefit to recovery. As Jeff mentioned, Raya 9 staffs a watershed ecosystem forum, which oversees the work program, has decision-making authority related to operational budgets, funding recommendations, and all planning related initiatives. This forum includes representatives from across the watershed, including all 17 local government partners. Auburn's been a really active participant in this forum and has held several leadership roles over the years. Prior to 2020, former council member Bill Pelosa was a longtime co-chair of the Watershed Ecosystem Forum. Since his departure, Councilmember Stearns has served on both the forum and the management committee. And I also just want to thank Jeff Tate for his engagement as the city's alternate delegate. Since its inception, the RIA 9 construct has been successful in securing local, state, and federal funds. With approximately $200 million of investments, partners have realigned more than 2 miles of levees to reconnect floodplains, restored more than 4,500 feet of marine shoreline, and revegetated over 500 acres of land. The picture on the upper right shows Riverview Park in Kent, which was completed in 2012. This was a $3 million project that involved construction of 750 feet of side channel to provide rearing habitat for juvenile fish. And you can see the pedestrian bridge spanning the channel. The lower picture is Auburn's own Fenster Park. This was a 2-phase project that involved setback of over 1,250 feet of an old agricultural levee to reconnect floodplain habitat and expand juvenile rearing habitat. The project cost about $2 million and was completed in 2014. And I just want to take a moment to thank Auburn for their long-term support. Over the last 20 years, ILA cost share partners, including the City of Auburn, have collectively contributed over $8.4 million to the program. This is a significant investment that's helped build our collaborative partnership and has positioned the watershed for success that it's had in terms of leveraging outside dollars. So this slide highlights a reach of river that extends from Auburn's Fenster Park to Neely Bridge at State Route 18. This is a 1.5 mile reach of river that has been a focal area for salmon recovery efforts. The top picture is an aerial photo from 2002. You can see that there are 3 separate levees that constrain the river, restricted floodplain connectivity, and available rearing habitat. All 3 of these levees has since been removed and or set back to allow the river to re-engage with the historic floodplain. As you can see in the 2019 photo on the bottom, the changes have been dramatic and have resulted in a very dynamic reach of river that provides really valuable salmon habitat. Starting with Auburn Narrows here with the yellow arrow, the river has begun eroding on this left bank. Although difficult to see, there's now a 500-foot side channel that provides accessible habitat for juvenile fish. Then in orange, here's the Potski levee setback. The top orange arrow shows what has now become the largest log jam in the entire Green River system with hundreds of pieces of wood. The lower right arrow highlights where the river has abandoned this historic channel that you can see up above. Now this channel is, contains water at higher flows and provides really valuable refuge habitat for juvenile salmon looking to escape high flows. And this orange area on the left, you can see where the river has started to engage this portion of the floodplain and is actively eroding it, creating valuable backwater and side channel habitat. And then finally here on the left in red, this is Fenster Park. The new buried revetment goes along this obvious pedestrian path. The setback has allowed the river to be more dynamic, which you can see in this increase in sinuosity, as well as this formation of this gravel bar on the right bank. This reach really is a great example of the City of Auburn and the county working collaboratively to restore critically needed salmon habitat along the Green River. So I also wanted to take a moment just to highlight the investments Auburn's been making in building community partnerships to promote revegetation of the green. Auburn's Parks Department, under leadership of Jamie Kelly, has helped forge really strong, good working relationships with Mid-Sound Fisheries Enhancement Group and the Green River Coalition to engage the community in local restoration efforts. These partnerships are critical to help increasing tree cover along the river corridor to address high in-stream temperatures that have been shown in recent years to even reach potentially lethal levels during late hot summer periods. RIA 9 has awarded a series of Regreen the Green revegetation grants to support these efforts at locations including Fenster and Isaac Evans Parks. As you can see in these pictures, these community events really have been successful in engaging local residents and helping build awareness and public support for recovery. And if you haven't already had a chance to get out to one of these events, I'd Like the mayor here at Fenster Park, I really do urge you to consider joining one of these events. It's really great to get out there and see just how much work is getting done through these events. So this chart shows the annual salmon returns since 1990. The green line depicts naturally spawning wild fish, and the blue line depicts natural and hatchery origin fish. You can see that despite all this implementation progress, we really haven't seen a significant rebound in Chinook. Following the ESA listing, Chinook numbers basically crashed in 2009 to an all-time low of less than 200 fish in the whole watershed. Although numbers have increased since then, numbers in 5 out of the 10 last years have been below our short-term planning target of 1,000 to 4,200 fish. Unfortunately, this is a trend that's not unique to our watershed. It can be seen across Puget Sound, and it highlights the need to accelerate and amplify our work. So the 2021 Habitat Plan update represents the next chapter in our efforts to restore salmon in our watershed. The plan update process really did validate the strength of the original 2005 plan. As a result, the update really reflects a series of tweaks and adjustments as opposed to a complete overhaul. By incorporating new best available science, it provides an updated science-based framework for identifying, prioritizing, and implementing recovery actions over the next 10 to 15 years. The plan contains policy and programmatic actions captured within 11 overarching recovery strategies. These range from protecting and restoring floodplain connectivity to expanding public outreach and behavior change initiatives. It also contains an updated project list with 118 conceptual project ideas. These conceptual projects were developed in cooperation with all of our local partners. And finally, the plan contains an element to support regular assessment of progress to help inform adjustments to ensure that we continue to invest in the best available projects to maximize our return on our investments. So this graphic portrays a simple life cycle model of the Chinook salmon in relation to the 5 subwatersheds in the Raya-9. The city of Auburn lies within the Lower Green River subwatershed that extends from about River Mile 32 along the eastern edge of the city limits downstream to River Mile 11 near the 405 freeway. The Lower Green serves as an important migratory corridor for both upstream migration and juvenile downstream migration. As you know, much of the Lower Green Basin has been heavily modified and now includes an extensive system of levees and revetments to protect existing development. This has resulted in large stretches of river being disconnected from the floodplain, as well as contributed to the loss of significant tree coverage along much of the river corridor. Based on recent research, we now know that available rearing habitat, such as these floodplain wetlands and side channels that we've been talking about, is the key limiting factor for increasing productivity of Chinook salmon in our watershed. So the plan update outlines a variety of recovery strategies for the Lower Green. These key strategies include protecting and restoring floodplain connectivity and channel complexity to increase available rearing habitat, revegetating riparian corridors to help reduce in-stream water temperatures, and protecting and enhancing water quality. To be honest here, restoring floodplain connectivity, it's a significant challenge in the Lower Green. We all know this is a heavily developed subwatershed. Land availability is scarce, and the need for flood protection is undoubtedly real. We certainly aren't going to be able to create many of those large reaches of restored river landscapes like we saw on the reach from Fenster to Neely Bridge. In order to achieve meaningful progress, identifying and advancing multi-benefit projects that help advance flood risk reduction, open space protection, as well as creating salmon habitat will be critical for our success. Some of you may have heard or seen in the news the recent Downey Farmstead project being constructed in Kent this summer. This is a great example of a multi-benefit project. It's not only providing critical salmon habitat, but it's also increasing flood storage capacity, and modeling has shown that it's projected to reduce flood elevations by about 1/2 foot during your normal 100-year event. This recognition of the need for a multi-benefit approach is consistent with the Flood Control District's commitment to a countywide multi-benefit strategy and the recent creation of 3 new grant opportunities with $12 million of funding. So the plan update, as I mentioned, includes about 118 capital projects. 45 of those are located in the lower green subwatershed, shown here on this map. And then about 8 of those are located in or adjacent to the city of Auburn, as shown within the orange circle. At this point, projects included in the plan are largely conceptual ideas. Inclusion in the plan indicates a potential opportunity and is not indicative of any commitment by any party to implement a given project. Each project has its own set of constraints and challenges that ultimately would need to be addressed before a project can even be considered feasible. Some of these projects, such as Mill and Olson Creek, are project ideas that are simply carried forward from the original 2005 plan. And I want to take a moment to thank again Jeff Tate and Jamie Kelly for their help in kind of talking through these project concepts and help refining them to where they can be included in the plan. And I just want to quickly go through 3 of those projects, just a very high level overview. The first is Lower Mill Creek. This project's located in the northwest portion of the city, adjacent to State Route 167. The site, although undeveloped, is a disturbed wetland that's dominated by invasive reed canary grass. The creek has been straightened and channelized to support historical agricultural activities. The long-term goal now really is to acquire the remaining private property, re-meander the stream, and revegetate the site to help address high water temperatures and improve habitat in the creek. It's also believed that through restoration, we can hopefully also address or alleviate flooding concerns and improve water conveyance along this site. The city of Auburn already owns a couple of parcels in this site and is currently pursuing acquisition of another 7+ acres at this location. Acquisition is being funded by a combination of a RIA 9 Cooperative Watershed Management Grant and a County Conservation Futures Award. And I just want to note that this project really nicely complements the city's efforts at Auburn's Environmental Park, as well as the Mill Creek Wetland 5K Restoration Site. These are located about a mile upstream. When viewed collectively, this reach of Mill Creek, has the potential to provide almost 2.5 miles of high quality salmon habitat. And that's just really impressive in an urban environment. The next project I wanted to cover is 104th Avenue Park. As you guys certainly are aware, this is a great site, and it's actually the city's currently developing as a 14.73 acre park, community park. The western portion shown up here is being targeted more for passive recreation and some invasive plant removal. The conceptual idea at this point is really just to explore the possibility of, is it possible to align a side channel through here? The project, like I said, is really conceptual at this point. Long-term feasibility depends on potential land availability and the ability to design a habitat project that's not only compatible with, but enhances the existing park. So if pursued, again, this has a great opportunity to be a multi-benefit project to increase flood storage along this portion of the site and help reduce pressure along the opposite bank where the houses are built up right against the Dykstra levee. The final project I wanted to highlight is the Port of Seattle mitigation site. The port owns a 65-acre site that supports a wetland complex that was constructed as mitigation for the 3rd runway at SeaTac. As part of this mitigation, a permanent conservation easement was placed on the property. Despite the undeveloped and conserved nature of the site, the wetlands are not actually within the 100-year floodplain and provide no accessible access or habitat for juvenile fish. The restoration concept is really to reconnect that floodplain habitat and create regularly inundated off-channel habitat for juvenile salmon. This obviously 65 acres is a large site and it has a high potential to really increase floodplain water storage capacity of this reach. Despite the absence of an actual levee along this site, reconnecting this area obviously has some significant constraints. It's going to have to be carefully designed. There's a neighborhood immediately to the north and immediately to the south, and definitely would need to ensure adequate flood protection for those housing developments. In addition, this is a portion of the Green River Trail that's an existing gap, and future development restoration of this site would need to consider that future alignment of the Green River Trail. So with respect to plan implementation, RIA9 really is committed to working with all of our partners, including the City of Auburn, to support plan implementation. RIA9 develops an annual funding package to fund high priority projects. This package is brought to the Watershed Ecosystem Forum every May for approval. Primary funding sources include cooperative watershed management grants provided by the King County Flood Control District, and Salmon Recovery Funding Board and Puget Sound Acquisition and Restoration Funds from the state of Washington. RIA9 staff currently coordinates with all of our partners to inform out-year planning related to capital project needs and maintains a 6-year implementation plan to help out with planning these investments. So looking forward, I just wanted to highlight a couple of significant regional projects that really are critical to supporting salmon recovery in our watershed. The first is the cleanup of the lower Duwamish waterway. This will help address contamination levels that we're observing in Chinook salmon that are likely impacting overall survival rates. Also, we're beginning to see a number of Duwamish restoration projects come online as liable parties satisfy their obligations for legacy natural resource damages associated with the lower Duwamish Superfund site. The other project, which has gotten a lot of headlines in the last couple of years, is downstream fish passage at Howard Hansen Dam. Fish passage is seen as fundamental to salmon recovery in our watershed. And providing fish passage at Howard Hansen opens up about 40% of the historically available salmon habitat in our watershed. In 2019, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, released a biological opinion stating that continued operation of the dam without passage jeopardizes both long-term survival of Chinook as well as orca. And the biological opinion now requires the Corps to construct downstream fish passage by 2031. And in 2020, the bipartisan Washington congressional delegation wrote a letter of support to the Corps, emphasizing the importance of this project to the region and the need for federal funding. So the Watershed Ecosystem Forum unanimously approved the plan update in February. The final step in the plan update process is local government ratification, just like in the 2005 plan. Ratification acknowledges that our local government partners all support the plan and are committed to working collaboratively to support implementation. It also acknowledges that salmon recovery is not a standalone initiative. It's inherently linked to a lot of our community priorities, such as flood risk reduction, stormwater, and recreation. As such, we really should be striving for these multi-benefit projects. And finally, ratification acknowledges the plan as an important source of best available science that really should help inform local actions. So before I open it up to questions, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the RIA9 team. Although we reside within King County Department of Natural Resources, we are the collective staff of the RIA9 Watershed Ecosystem Forum and are supported by your ILA cost share contributions. As such, I really want to emphasize that we stand ready to support the City of Auburn in any way that we can in terms of advancing salmon recovery priorities. And if you have any questions regarding salmon recovery or anything that we can help out with, please don't hesitate to contact me or any of the staff. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Matt, if I could add one piece just for council awareness too, is in your packet is resolution 5589. And our hope is to bring resolution 5589 forward to city council at next city council meeting on July 6th. And that is the resolution that Matt's referring to, which would be a ratification or a statement of support for the updated salmon recovery plan. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. Matt, thank you for the update and the presentation. It's always good to hear from you and what we're doing to take care of our issues. Council questions for Matt. Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I mean, you know, I'm just so amazed by the work that you guys do. And, you know, I'm really grateful to, you know, when I joined the council, the former council member Bill Pelosa, who suggested to me that this would be a really good thing to do. And he was 100% right. It's absolutely amazing. And I just want to also thank Jeff for all the work that he does too. I had a question on Matt, on the map you had, which showed some of the sites in Auburn. One was LG 46, and I think that was along Mill Creek, but I'm not entirely sure what that project is. And you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, LG 46 is another Mill Creek project. It's between the lower Mill Creek and the Auburn Environmental Park. And again, this is very similar to what existed at both of the other sites in terms of it's a largely straightened channel dominated by reed canary grass. And it's just a more opportunity to remeander the channel and restore the historical creek function.
Oh, great, thanks. And then you had talked a bit about the Port of Seattle, the third runway mitigation site. Well, I walk by there, well, almost every day. I mean, not now, it's way too hot, but you know, it's just gorgeous. There are all kinds of like deer and animals, other animals back there, what we call critters in the Navajo language. I was just wondering, what is the timeline for that?
Yeah, so right now there really is no timeline. We've, you know, when we were kind of doing the plan update process, we were kind of looking at the whole system, looking at opportunities. And we actually thought, we didn't know that any opportunity would really exist there. We were worried about, you know, kind of the regulatory hurdles associated with kind of the long-term commitments of the wetland mitigation. But in discussions with the port, they actually have met those obligations. And so they believe that it would probably be largely supported by the regulators to open it up. The issue in terms of the port is, I'm not sure if you've heard, but they recently have released a mitigation banking prospectus. They are looking to develop a series of mitigation banks largely in the Duwamish, and they actually to help kind of provide a mechanism for other liable parties to meet their obligations since they have such significant land holdings down there. And they actually explored with the regulators whether they could kind of roll this one into it. And why they were supportive, why the regulators were supportive of the concept, they weren't supportive of it applying as mitigation banking because they believe, well, you already got credit for the wetlands, so we're not going to let you double credit. So that is a long way of getting to your timeline question of, you know, the port's not, you know, the port has a financial bottom line. They're probably not going to directly invest in this in the short term. If it doesn't fulfill that mitigation element, what they've told us is they largely support it, but they would be looking for salmon recovery dollars if this was to move forward rather than kind of port funds. So yeah, there really is no timeline right now. And certainly, you know, like I said, there's, you know, some flood risk reduction as well as kind of the Green River Trail issues that would have to be worked through.
I have a third question, but I can wait. Deputy Mayor.
Let's go to Councilmember Trump Manuel, then come back to you, Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. This could either go to Jeff or Matt. On the 104th Avenue Park, what's the cost on that? And you have in here really tiny little prints invasive species, removal under tree canopy. Is that to help the waters flow through there a lot better, or could you explain more?
Yeah, I'm happy to help out. And Jeff, chime in if you know the cost. The cost associated with the park would be completely separate from any future restoration component on kind of the western side, if that was deemed feasible. So I'm not exactly, I don't remember the figure on the park cost. And we don't have a good estimate on what the restoration would cost. We'd have to get further along in feasibility and design. But the invasive species removal, that's just that I think is going to occur with just park development. And that's just helping kind of forest health and help native tree species have better survival and just better ecological health. It would be a completely separate initiative from any kind of larger habitat restoration involving kind of a side channel or anything like that.
And
So
I can add on the cost side. It might be a better question to Daryl,
Yeah.
because it's actually a parks project that.
Yeah, I'd be
Parks will
happy to answer that, Jeff.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that the project that we have going out to bid relatively soon is for the parking lot, playground area, restroom, nature trail, etc. And we are spending approximately 1.2 million. It's 50% of that is city impact fees, and the other percent is a state RCO grant that we got for water access. So the project that's discussed here would actually improve the salmon habitat, but that hasn't been applied for or granted at this point. But a project that we're looking into in cooperation with WIRA 9.
thank you. That pretty much answers my question. Thank you very much, Daryl.
You're welcome.
Great. Councilmember Stearns, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Matt, at the beginning of your presentation, you had a chart that showed the historical decline of salmon. And I was just wondering, is there ever going to be a chance that we could get back to the 1950 levels?
It's a tough, it's a question that actually gets asked a lot in terms of, how much can we actually expect to recover? And it's a difficult piece. It's a difficult thing to answer. While we know when we build certain projects, we have data showing that salmon are using them. It's really hard to kind of filter out the noise associated with, you hear about these marine blobs, right? And that, these warm ocean temperatures and impacting salmon survival, all the way up to Alaska. And so right now we're in a really bad period of ocean conditions, and we've seen very low juvenile salmon survival rates. And so with that this ecological variation that's outside of the control of how much habitat's here, it's just really hard to decipher the noise. And without being able to decipher that noise, it's really hard to say how far we could get, how close could we get back to those historical numbers. I will say that it's pretty widely accepted in our region that Fish Passage at Howard Hansen is one of the biggest projects left in Puget Sound in terms of opening up new habitat. That's almost doubling the amount of habitat. Like I showed, Auburn and the county have done a huge lift with that reach from Fenster up to the Neely Bridge. But you're not going to create that in a lot of other sections in the Lower Green. The land is just not there. Without, I would say, the chances of getting there to 1950 levels without a downstream fish passage, not possible. Fish passage really is fundamental to recovery of our watershed.
Well, thank you so much. That was a good answer. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Council, any other questions for Matt this evening? Okay, not seeing it. Matt, thank you again very much for the update and for the excellent presentation.
All right, thank you again for the opportunity, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And Jeff, do you have anything else that you needed to add, or I'll just?
No, thank you
Okay.
for asking.
Okay.
We'll move it forward to the July 6th agenda, it sounds like, for council.
Very good.
consideration.
All right, thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, council, we will now move on to ordinance number 6826 with City Attorney Como.
Okay. That time it took me to unmute will
Oh, there.
allow you
All
to
right,
understand that it's
we'll have
not.
Assistant City Attorney Doug. Ruth.
Exactly. That's probably pretty apparent. All right. So since I have just 5 minutes to cover this ordinance, and because my bucket of ice is quickly melting over here, I'm going to just do an abbreviated background. I'm going to assume that most of you understand or know about civil service laws. They've been around since the 30s. Their intent was to reduce or eliminate the favoritism or political allegiance basis for hiring public employees, and instead base it on merit of the qualified candidates. In Washington, I think every state has civil service laws, but in Washington, they just apply to fire departments, fire employees, and police employees. They're codified in state law, but actually a lot of the mechanics of civil service is handled at the local level through a civil service commission, a 3-member board. We have one, of course, in Auburn. Any county or city that has a police or fire jurisdiction or any district. In the case of fire districts, would have a civil service commission. For us, that commission is set up in code 2.57 of our Auburn City Code. And then the commission sets up its own rules, which really handle a lot, the bulk of the mechanics of testing candidates, setting up appointment criteria, and handling appeals if someone feels like they weren't hired justifiably. So that's the background. As I mentioned, the code for Auburn is in 2.57, and that's what the ordinance that we're looking at today concerns. Really, it's just a cleanup ordinance here. Some civil service issues came up and gave our office occasion to look at the law more closely and see that there was some antiquated language there. We just wanted to make it more clear, get rid of the heretofores and thereofs. And we also took out 2 outdated references, one to fire departments, which the city since I think 2008, 2007, no longer has a fire department, of course, with the creation of Valley District. And it also takes out references to the classification of temporary deputy chief, which is that classification is now handled by the police chief and the Civil Service Commission under the current state law. So in your packets, you should have an underlined and striked out version of what is being changed here. It's a little messy, and that just shows you how long it's been since this city code has been updated. I think it's since 2005. So there's really some antiquated language there, and we get rid of that. So I'm just going to briefly go over that. And if I can share my screen, am I able to do that, Sean? Here we
It's
go.
yours, the green thing at the bottom.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you. I'm just going to show you what I think here is the how it will look when all change, and I think that that'll help to make it a little more clear about what's happening here and what's left. But quickly going over it, I'll just go to the first section, 0.010. Of course, it makes into an A and a B subsection, which is a little more clear. It takes out references to RCW 41.08, which deals with fire departments, and it limits the section to police, since that's all our Civil Service Commission handles in Auburn. It moves around some of the language, the appointing and removal language referencing ACC 2.30 and 4112 were moved up higher, but those were always there. And it removes, the bulk of the changes are removal of instructions for adopting the 4112 state law by reference. When we adopted that way back decades ago, there were requirements in making that adoption. For instance, having the clerk have the code available for anyone to look at. And those just aren't relevant anymore since we've adopted by reference the RCW. So those can just be eliminated. Moving on to the next section, 0.020. It removes references to the fire department again and removes references to the temporary deputy chief being exempt, and that now would need to be assigned by the police chief. Moving to 030, again, takes out the fire department references, rearranges the language quite a bit. And you can see it's shortened here. I kind of think of this, I can scroll here a little bit. I think of this as the person in the family that's really good at packing the car for a long trip. You know, just by rearranging it a little bit in the car, you can get a better fit. And I think that's what we've done here. We've just moved this language around, and I think we have something clearer, but there's no substantive change in 030. It's all there. It's just updated and rearranged. Moving to 040, and let me see if I can page down here. Well, I trust you guys are following. There we go. 040 removes the references to the anachronisms I referenced, the fire department and the assistant police chief reference. Here it's assistant police chief. I'm not sure why it referenced deputy police chief above. So again, we had some confusing language, and that'll be removed. And finally, in 050, it just removes references to the fire department, and all the substance is still the same. So it's a cleanup ordinance that is good to do every once in a while to make it clear for anyone reading it and to eliminate any kind of confusion that may lead to litigation or questions about how the civil service runs. So I'm open for questions.
Questions for Doug, Council?
Councilmember J. Rogers raised his hand.
Yep, sure. Thank you. Councilmember J. Raj.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Doug, good afternoon. The question that I have is, why did it take so long for the updates? Why so many years?
I think it was because we don't often have issues come up in the Civil Service Commission. It runs according to state law and the rules, and the commissioners are used to, you know, how the procedures go in appointing new police employees or giving promotions. And so when the issues don't come up, there's not a real reason to look at the code. And I'm not sure what, if any, issue came up recently. We did have an appointment, of course, with a new police chief, and maybe it was because of that. I'm not sure. I don't advise the Civil Service Commission, but I think it was something that caused us to look at it. And then you just see all this antiquated language that's confusing. So that's the only real explanation I can give, is that you didn't go underneath the hood to find out that your engine was dirty. And it's only when you do that, when you have a chance to pop the hood, that you look at it and say, oh, well, this really should be updated.
Is there a way that we can kind of keep it updated so that we don't have so many years pass by us before we look at it again?
Yes, and I see that goal. I sympathize with that goal. Our office has generally tried to, in the last couple of years, sort of get rid of that old language. As I mentioned, the terms that you see the most that people don't understand is the heretofore, which was a regular legal term. It still is a legal term. It was regularly used a decade ago. But we have been trying to, not just in the code, but in our policies and just in our legal work. So yeah, progressively, I think as we move along and have reason to change maybe some substance, we will also change the antiquated language. And we have done that on several codes already. Offhand, I can't think off the top of my head what they've been, but I know that I've reviewed substantive changes where then we make clarifying changes as well. The disadvantage to that is sometimes it clutters up what's changing in the substance. And so we present to you this longer ordinance with a lot of changes, and it looks overwhelming. And a lot of them are just clarifying, and maybe the substance gets lost in that. So, we try to have a balance there. But yes, we will try to continue to update language where we see need.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate your answers. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
You're welcome. Any other questions for Doug, Council? Okay, not seeing any. Doug, we appreciate you being here, and I'm glad you have a bucket of ice. I'm glad you maintained your sense of humor, and I'm glad to see you're still wearing a bow tie. So thank you again. And
Thank you.
yeah, let's wipe the brow because a little bit of sweat going out here with the temperature as it is. So
Yes.
appreciate it again.
Thank you.
Okay, Council will now move into our Public Works and Community Development discussion items. And for that, I will turn this segment of the meeting over to Councilmember Stearns.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And we have 2 items. The first is on lead and copper rule revisions. And the second is the second in the series we have on environmental regulations and protection. So I will turn it over to Director Goff.
Thank you and good evening. So tonight I'm actually going to pass this over to Lisa Tobin, our Utilities Engineering Manager, and Susan Fenhouse, our Water Utility Engineer, to talk to you about the revisions to the lead and copper rule and kind of go over what that means for Auburn. So Susan, you want to go ahead and take it?
Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Right on. Fudge. There we go. All right, good evening. I'm going to be talking about the lead and copper rule and the original 1991 rule and then the 2021 revisions, what the impacts are on Auburn, a capital project that we have coming up, and finally, some public outreach. The lead and copper rule is complicated. It's the only regulation that requires a water system to sample in customers' homes. Now, the water from our wells and springs does not have any lead, but some of our customers' piping or plumbing fixtures may contain lead. And as the water sits in the pipes, it has the potential to absorb the lead. EPA set allowable limits for lead and copper in drinking water. And if more than 10% of the samples taken from homes exceed that limit, then utilities are required to treat the water. Now, because our water comes from groundwater, it naturally has a lower pH level. And this can make the water corrosive. The city constructed the Howard Road and the Fulmer corrosion control facilities in 2004. The photo here on my slide is of the Fulmer facility. So we use aeration to treat the water. This raises the pH to make the water less corrosive and to reduce the potential to leach lead from the piping. We do not add chemicals to treat the water. And as we have been doing our periodic testing that's been required, our results have been well below the limits. So the revisions to the rule put the emphasis on educating our customers about lead hazards and what they can do to minimize the exposure. Lead service lines are primarily an issue in the eastern states, and we are not aware of any lead service lines here in Auburn. And because our monitoring will be a little more stringent with this revised rule, the results may require that we modified our corrosion control treatment. And the last part of this is protecting children's health. So the rule requires that you monitor for lead in schools and in child care facilities. And this is something new. It has not been previously done. So how does this impact us? By October of 2024, we will have to complete an inventory of all service lines. This includes the portion that the city owns from the main to the meter, and also the portion the customer owns from the meter into their home. The inventory will indicate that the material, the pipe, is either lead, it's non-lead, could be copper or plastic, or material unknown. And then this inventory we will make available to the public. We will likely be asking our customers to tell us what their pipe material is. And we anticipate that a significant portion of the customer side will be material unknown. And finally, every line on this inventory that is designated either lead or material unknown, those customers we will notify annually, again, about the hazards of lead. And because the rules changed, we will be looking for some new sampling locations to meet the new criteria. And now I'd mentioned that the rule states that monitoring will be done in schools. However, the Washington State Legislature put the responsibility of sampling in schools on the Department of Health. So the city will only have to sample in daycares. We have known for several years that revisions to this rule would be coming. We also know that we do not have any lead service lines in the city, of the city's portion anyway. But we do have gooseneck connections. Now, goosenecks were very common, used as a way to connect a rigid service line, usually galvanized, with a rigid water line. And so it's just a short, flexible piece of lead pipe, maybe about 12 inches long. So the potential exposure to lead from this gooseneck is really very minimal. And over time, as we've been replacing water main, the older main in town, we've also been removing these goosenecks. So right now we have a capital project that will be removing the remaining 200 of these gooseneck connections. And this project, as you can see from the photo, the map here, is in mostly the older or the central part of the city. Now, again, a key part of the regulation is public education. So outreach is going to be definitely an important piece of doing this. We recently had an article in the summer issue of the Auburn Magazine talking about some of the things I've just talked about today. And we will be having other things too. We'll have bill stuffers, we'll have letters and flyers going out to our customers. We'll have to do the annual inventory report. That'll be starting in 2024. And then we'll be having information on our website. And some of our printed information we expect to have in more than one language, because we do have a pretty diverse population that we need to reach with all of this information. So I guess that's it. Are there any questions?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, do we have any questions?
Councilmember J. Rogers raised his hand.
Councilmember J-Rod.
Thank you, Council Member Stearns. Mike, I have two questions. First of all, when do we plan on replacing all the 200 goosenecks piping? How I know you've got 200 of them. That's going to take some time, but seems like you need to get the inventory done by 2024. I'm kind of like thinking that's not far away.
That's correct. And actually, the remaining 200 gooseneck connections that we know of, we will be replacing with this capital project starting sometime this year, 2021, and the project extending on into 2022. The inventory will be of all the other materials that we don't currently know.
Okay. So by 2022, you'll be able to get everything done then? Is that what you're trying to say?
That is our goal, yes.
So
That's the goal.
If I can clarify, so by 2022, we'll have the lead goosenecks replaced, those 200. The inventory of all of the service lines for both the city side and the private owner side. That may take a little bit longer. The intent is to have that completed by 2024, which is when we need to start reporting on it.
Okay. So after you report, what happens? I mean, what's the outcome of it is what I would like to know.
The outcome is really public education. Helping our customers understand that either yes, they do have a lead component in their service line, or no, they don't. And we currently feel that they don't, but we don't know what they have on the customer side. And also that just the interior plumbing, the fact that lead solder was used, fixtures had lead in them, and what their exposure might be, what their risks are to the lead, and what they can do to minimize that. That's what the outcome is.
So we as a city might have to tell them to replace those things if there's lead.
We can't really tell them to, but we can recommend that they do, just
Okay.
for their own
Okay.
protection.
Okay. Final question. Aeration. You said we don't, our pH level is low. You said aeration. I mean, I know what aerating means, but I don't know what aeration means.
That's okay. Aeration is adding water, or I'm sorry, adding air to the water. And the picture,
okay.
The picture there was of the towers, where the water goes into the towers and air blows up through that and adds the air to the water.
Oh, okay. Can we do a seltzer water too at the same time?
Sorry, no, we don't have that many bubbles.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Council Member Stearns.
Thank you, Councilmember Jayraj. The questions were really insightful because, yeah, I don't think there's like an acceptable amount of lead that humans can consume. You know, we have been, you know, as a nation, I mean, we started removing lead from paints like in the 70s because we know how dangerous and toxic it is. So it's really good to hear that, you know, as a city, we're, you know, ahead of the curve, it seems like. But yeah, the goal is to get to zero because it's just not safe. Are there any other questions? If not, I have a couple, Susan. I was wondering, will we be applying a new equity lens to the survey results, or, you know, or even how the survey is designed?
I'm not sure that we have planned that far ahead as far as what that might be. It's definitely something that we are going to be talking about as we're putting this inventory together.
Great, that's wonderful to hear. And then the last question I have is, you know, the Biden administration has delayed the lead and copper rule until December so they can, you know, go through it. I mean, do you think they're going to make any changes to it and, you know, maybe make it a little bit stricter, or do you have a sense about that?
I don't have a good sense of that. I do know that earlier today, I was participating in a discussion with Department of Health, and they talked a little bit about that. But other than their opinion on what they recommended with the comment period, that's really all they were able to share.
Okay. Did they mention also anything about the infrastructure package that's being negotiated in Congress and the White House? Because I guess it sounds like, you know, at least from the White House's end, they want to include money for lead and copper in the new infrastructure package.
We did not have any discussion this morning on that.
Right. Great. Well, looks like Council Member Trout Manuel, you have a question? Please.
Yes, Susan, you mentioned that the health department is going to be going and checking the daycare providers. Is that just the daycare centers, just the daycare centers, or are they going to do all daycare facilities?
I believe the regulation states licensed daycare. So that would be,
In-home daycares?
yes.
Yeah. So what if there's a daycare facility that can't afford to do this? Is there any fundings to help these individuals to be able to complete, if they get a citation or something and they have a length of time to get it completed, is there any fundings for help for them?
There's none that I know of right now. And the daycare itself wouldn't get necessarily a citation as much as just a notification that we sampled here and your level is this. This was the level of lead that was detected and what that means to them. It might mean that, yes, maybe you do need to replace fixtures.
Okay, because I know when I was, when I had a mini daycare, I had well water and the health department came over to test my well. And we had a homeowner building another home across the street, and from all the shake of the ground that they were doing, it caused my water to have E. coli. So I was given a citation. For 30 days, I could not give water to my students. I had to boil the water, and they gave me time to be able to flush it out. But I was just wondering if this is something like that as well. So that's why I was asking.
No, it's not quite like that. It's more of
Okay.
just a notification that here's the levels.
Okay, thank you.
Or are there any other questions? I don't think I see any. So thank you, Susan. That was a really great presentation. We really appreciate your time and expertise and work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like next up we have Director Jeff Tate with the environmental regulation presentation. So you're here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Stearns. I would like to turn it over to Daniel Gauk, Senior Planner within the Department of Community Development, who's going to provide a presentation to Council. This is the series of environmental presentations that we're conducting throughout the majority of 2021. And this is presentation number 2. So with that, I will turn it over to Daniel.
Thanks, Jeff. Get my screen up here. And Jeff kind of went through basically what I was going to say in my first slide, but good evening, council members, deputy mayor, mayor. Daniel Gauk, one of the senior planners here, like Jeff mentioned, in community development. Tonight, I'm presenting the second presentation in the planning series, environmental regulation, planning services, environmental regulation series. Sorry. This is the second in a series of 6 presentations that will be given to council over the course of the year. So to discuss the city's array of environmental regulations and programs. This presentation is covering the Critical Areas Ordinance, or CAO. This presentation, it begins on page 48 in your PDF packet. So in case you're not already there, I have about 12 or 13 slides to go through tonight. And hopefully you can hold off for your questions until the end so we can get through everything efficiently. So, a clicker. One second here. Okay, so starting off, what are critical areas? Critical areas are generally, essentially they're environmentally sensitive lands that provide ecological and community benefits. I'll go into more details in later slides, but within the city of Auburn, there's 6 types of critical areas that we regulate. There's wetlands, streams, including the Green and White rivers, geologic hazard areas, aquifer recharge areas, flood hazard areas, and wildlife habitat. And often a physical location can contain multiple critical areas, such as habitat for fish in a regulated stream or a wetland next to the Green River. Okay, so how do we protect critical areas? First off, the Growth Management Act, or GMA, it requires most cities to develop rules to protect critical areas. Auburn first adopted these back in 2005. The city, we use what's called a Critical Areas Ordinance, or a CAO, which is located in the city code in chapter 1610. And this was most recently updated by council back in 2019, which I think was the last time I presented in front of council. So this code section contains the regulations and standards for protecting, enhancing, and or altering critical areas. Some critical areas cannot be altered, such as the most hazardous classification of geologic hazard. While floodplains are categorized as a critical areas, its regulations are found in a separate chapter, which is chapter 15.68. Which contains the regulations for flood hazard areas, which was also updated back last year in 2020. And then council will see a presentation on floodplain management as a part of this series in October as well. Some sections of the Critical Areas Ordinance rely on what's called best available science. These are used to determine the categorical ratings for streams, wetlands, and habitat areas. Best available science is developed, and it's based on years of research by agencies such as Department of Ecology, and is done in conjunction with other scientific studies and scientists. Most local jurisdictions also have also adopted these best available sciences in their critical areas ordinances. For geologic hazards, typically an engineer is required, and then for floodplains and groundwater protection areas, it's a combination of an engineer and also a biologist. The SMP, or the Shoreline Master Program, which also the council approved of an update in 2019, along with the Critical Areas Ordinance. This contains the development regulations for anything that falls within 200 feet of the Green or the White rivers. And again, you'll see, council will see a presentation on the SMP in August, in about a month. So if there's a proposal for alterations to a critical area, such as realigning a stream or filling part of a wetland, this could also result in reviews and or approvals being required from other agencies, such as Department of Ecology, Army Corps of Engineers, who also have their own distinct permitting processes. Okay, so why do we protect critical areas? Well, the occurrence of critical areas is increasingly common now, since the easier land that's out there is likely already developed. And then different critical areas provide different functions. For instance, a wetland's main function could be for flood storage or for wildlife habitat. And again, I'll talk about more of these later in the presentation. But in general, protection of critical areas keeps drinking water clean, protects salmon and other wildlife in their habitats, reduces risk of injury or property damage, and provides open and passive recreational spaces. So in this presentation, timing seems like it was a good spot, since you heard about the Green River and the changes to that previously. So the first topic, topic will be all about wetlands. And I'd like to start by saying that there's a lot of information out there about wetlands. So I'll do my best to hopefully be clear and concise with all this information. And wetlands could be its own hour-long presentation. So hopefully I can get you enough information to be dangerous. So wetlands are a frequent critical area that homeowners and also developers, they have to interact with. Almost every project nowadays will require a minimum of wetland reconnaissance. to determine if wetlands are present. And that's basically a scientist or biologist going out and giving kind of eyeball check to see if they think there might be one. If there are potential wetlands out there, then they would be required to have a critical area study by a qualified biologist, go out there and do the study, and a mitigation plan sometimes is required as well. So there are 4 classifications or categories of wetlands in the city, ranging from 1 to 4, based on the quality of the resource, with 1 being the highest and most regulated. Wetland classifications or ratings are based on a nationally accepted method or methodology that's put together in a document prepared by the Army Corps, which you can see in the image here on the right side of the page. And then there's also a regional supplement to different areas. So there's one that applies to the Western states, which consultants use. And this manual is also what other cities and counties require to use, and consultants are comfortable with using it and used to it. So category 1 wetlands provide very high and likely irreplaceable functions, and thus they can't be altered, filled, or anything like that. We don't come across those too often. I guess in the 6 or 7 years I've been here, I haven't seen any. But categories 2 and 3, these are the most common wetlands that we encounter, and these also provide many valuable benefits. But oftentimes these wetlands and/or their buffers have been disturbed in the past, and then they require enhancement or restoration. And unfortunately, or fortunate, but these wetland restorations, they're pretty common due to historic alterations of these areas, and especially in the valley, and then past farming practices. Category 4 wetlands, they're typically small and in areas that they don't provide much environmental benefit. Typically, these are found in the valley in already developed areas. And then, in the valley and also in areas outside of the valley that are already developed. Excuse me. Let's see. And due to their the lack of environmental benefits, sometimes these wetlands can be filled with little to no permitting requirements, since they're so small. And then the city regulations, they also prescribe minimum buffer widths. Buffers are one of the most important things to consider when we're talking about protecting wetlands, as they provide undisturbed or enhanced areas, if previously disturbed, of native vegetation to protect the wetland itself. A big part of the habitat quality is related to the buffer, as there are many amphibians that use these areas for parts of their life cycle along with other critters. And then these buffers also provide important water quality benefits by filtering out the pollutants before they get into the groundwater for recharging the springs and such. And the minimum buffer widths, they can vary widely depending on the quality of the wetland function, and also depending on the quality of the wetland, and also what the function is that wetland is trying to protect. On the next slide, I have an image that shows why these buffers are so variable. And they'll show you, but the tables shown on this slide on the right side here, they are directly out of our code, so out of the Critical Areas Ordinance, Chapter 1610. But the functions of wetland, or the functions for a wetland vary as well. It could be for flood storage, could be for water quality, wildlife habitats, recreational or aesthetics, or any and all of the above. Many, if not most, wetlands in our area, they actually dry up during the summer months. But the soils within a wetland, what's kind of a standard saying is they stay wet enough for long enough during the growing season so that the soil chemistry actually changes, and then only in certain types of vegetation can grow in them. Wetlands also need to have a source of water. It could be surface water, groundwater, or just rain, precipitation. So then to be a wetland, it needs a source of water, a certain type of soil, and certain types of vegetation that can only grow in those soils. Just having damp ground or puddles or pools of water doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a wetland. But that being said, you don't necessarily need to see water for it to be a wetland. And I'll discuss that a bit more in a slide or two. So lastly, permitting alterations of wetland can be complex because, as I mentioned, there's other agencies permitting that's involved as well. There are different options for compensating or mitigating for alteration of a wetland. These include paying into an in lieu fee with the King or Pierce County program. They could construct a wetland on another piece of property within the same watershed. I think you heard about the watershed in that first presentation. Or if they have room, they could also mitigate it by constructing it on the site. Replacement values, when they're altering or filling portions of them, the replacement values are not 1-to-1. So depending on the rating, it could be up to 24-to-1. But most of the, based on the past applications that we've gotten, the replacement ratios are typically 3 or 4, up to 6 to 8-to-1. So, and there's a mitigation sequence where the project has to look at avoiding disturbing the wetlands. So these are usually kind of the bottom of the list, and they're expensive as well. So, and then the wide range in replacement ratios is due to several factors, but one of them being is what's called temporal loss. So they essentially calculate how many environmental functions are being lost between when the wetland is filled or altered and then when the replacement grows into maturity. I mentioned the in lieu fee programs, and these are essentially a bank of funds that's collected by the county, King or Pierce County, to do a wetland restoration project within the same watershed as the wetland being altered. And so they, for instance, King County, who we've done a number of projects, have paid to fill some typically small buffers into those funds. So that does give developers and homeowners another way to proceed. Alteration, so those we're talking about alteration to wetlands themselves. The alteration of a wetland buffer, it's not regulated by other agencies. So any buffer alterations are required or done on a case-by-case basis, and only city permitting is required. So this is the image I mentioned from that previous slide. This was actually done on a presentation from the Department of Ecology to the Planning Commission when they were reviewing the Critical Areas Ordinance update back in 2019. So as I mentioned, trying to fit all this wetland stuff into a couple slides, that presentation to the Planning Commission was, I think, at least an hour itself. So there's a lot out there. The red line on this image is the maximum buffer in the city, and also the largest that ecology recommends, and which we adopted. And then the blue bars are the minimum effective width, and then the green are the maximum for protecting whatever you're trying to do. So for instance, for water temperatures, it's a pretty small buffer, but those could be also pretty densely planted. And as you can see, depending on what you're trying to protect, the buffer width, they can vary widely, as I showed you in that previous table as well. Okay, so let's take a look at this if you want for a second, but these are some images that are indicators of a potential wetland in the field. The first and most obvious one would probably be water. If you see water, there could be a wetland. Also keeping in mind, like I said previously, that just seeing a puddle in a road or something doesn't mean it's going to be a wetland. There also could be no water visible, but then you dig down a foot or so and you could see water begin to start filling the holes, as you can see in that image furthest to the right. Or the soils could be just extremely saturated as well, depending on when you're digging during the year. And in these saturated soils, that's what causes changes to the soil. So they become hydric, so they lack oxygen, and then they chemically change to typically either gray with rust-colored spots or streaks, or just be darker than a typical or a non-wetland soil. So these are the types of soils or field indicators that we look at to determine if there's could be a wetland out there. And also, as I mentioned, wetlands often dry up during some point of the year. So this is where digging a hole and looking at the soils is especially helpful, as you can see if they meet the hydric soils definitions. Lastly, you would look for specific types of vegetation that grow in water or in saturated soils. Some examples would be like cattails or skunk cabbage. Those are kind of the, you see those and you're like, oh, there's a wetland, which those are typically only found in wetlands. Whereas there's other species as well that grow in wetlands or outside of wetlands, such as cedars and salmon berries, among others. So as I mentioned, you need three things to have a wetland: specific types of soils, a source of water, and certain types of vegetation. Moving on to the next critical area, I'll talk about streams. The city has adopted the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, water type classifications. There are 4 classifications of streams. First one are the type S, which are in Auburn would be the Green and White Rivers. And the SMP that I mentioned in the previous slide, that's a standalone document that includes the development regulations in or near these water bodies. And again, as I mentioned, we'll have a separate presentation on the SMP. The next would be type F streams, which are water bodies that contain fish, or they could meet the minimum requirements to contain fish. There are a few ways the stream could meet these fish-bearing requirements, such as the actual width of the water flowing in the stream channel, or the gradient or slope of the channel. So there's a certain slope percentage that a fish just simply can't get up. And these fish-bearing streams, they require a 100-foot buffer, and similar to wetlands, if they've been previously altered or they contain invasive species, then they'd be required to be restored or enhanced. The 2 images in the bottom right of this slide are actually from a type F stream restoration for a project that started back in 2018. In this case, the stream was modified from a straight ditch, so essentially to running along that tree line between the trees and the old barn. And then it was transformed into a natural meandering stream, which also included replantings to establish native vegetation, the protective fencing you can see there in the bottom right image. Signage, those types of things. They also added other natural habitat features. The ones you can see in this image are the logs, large woody debris, or LWD, which are essentially the logs in that bottom right picture. And I think Matt in that presentation, he mentioned the logs along the Green River that provide fish habitat as well. So hopefully eventually, this is kind of in the middle of a stream course, and hopefully with future development, they'll get, heading north, get some more fish-bearing stream restorations. And I think Matt mentioned it, but the large woody debris, those logs, they'll hopefully create pool pools for salmon breeding. They add shade to help cool water temperatures. They provide areas of slower moving water and also area of refuge for protection from predators. The next and most common types of streams are NP and NS. In Auburn, these often may connect to a fish-bearing stream. However, they don't meet the minimum requirements for fish due to typically it's a steep grade. So, and we have a lot of these in the northeastern section or area of West Hill, and then all along the west side of Lee Hill. On the next slide, I have a screenshot from the DNR mapping inventory that shows some of these streams. So this map shows streams that are in the DNR inventory and their potential ratings. So we use this website along with a number of others when we're researching project applications to help us determine if they're going to need, a stream reconnaissance or straight up critical area study, that type of thing. I note that I use the term inventory. So similar to other critical areas, we use different inventories to help us determine if there is one, as I mentioned, but they're based off of existing and available documents and maps that are available to us, or for in this instance, the DNR. And when they're creating these inventories, they use various information sources, and they're only used as guidance tools, since site-specific studies are always going to be required. And then to verify presence of a stream, show their location, and determine the classification. If the stream is then confirmed, then we'll require critical area study and potentially a mitigation plan. So I mentioned the Green and White rivers. Obviously, those are two big things in Auburn, but there are also several other named streams in the city, such as Mill Creek, Mullen Slough, Bowman Creek, Cobble Creek, I think is another one. And there's many more smaller tributaries throughout the city, and each typically threading its way eventually into the Green River. Okay, so the next topic here is geologically hazardous areas, or geohazards for short. These are areas that are susceptible to erosion, sliding, earthquakes, or other geological events. And these pose a threat, to the health and safety of people, of the citizens of Auburn, or when they cite a development that's too close to, or within, or even too close to these hazard areas. In the next slide, I have another mapped inventory that shows erosion prone and landslide hazard areas, which are the most commonly reviewed geohazards that we see. Critical area studies for geohazards are referred to as geotechnical reports, or geotechs for short. You may have heard that term in other presentations before. So the four types of geohazards are listed here on the slide. The first one being erosion prone areas. These include bluffs, steep slopes, and areas with what they term as unconsolidated soils. These are essentially uncompressed, and so they can't be built on. So essentially, if you put something on, if you built something on these soils, then the soils would become compressed, and then your building foundation or whatever is going to sink as well. Next one on the bullet, next bullet would be the landslide hazard areas. These have some combination of slope, soil type, high groundwater, and other factors which just make them potentially unstable. Seismic hazard areas, these have a combination of similar the loose soils, unconsolidated soils, and a high groundwater table, which makes them susceptible to liquefaction during earthquakes. These areas are mainly in the valley down here in the valley because of the high groundwater table. Then the last type would be volcanic hazards. These are areas of the valley that would be impacted if Mount Rainier were to blow, and then the mud flow coming out through the river valleys. So what are the objectives here? The ultimate goal of leaving geohazards is to leave them unaltered to protect both people and property, as I mentioned. This is done by achieving what's called no net loss, which per the WAC is shown here in the upper right corner. That basically says if you can't engineer your way out of risk, then that risk has to be avoided. There's obviously more details to this, but in general, developing or altering any slope over 40% is not allowed. Geohazard areas, they can also have an important function in maintaining habitat. So events such as landslides or debris flow, they can contribute sediment that's needed and wood or logs for building those in-stream habitats that are important for salmon and other fish and wildlife. But of course, these can obviously be not good, such as the picture shown here, a landslide on Highway 18 about 10 years ago. And then for these geotech reports, planners and then our development review engineers, we cooperate on the reviewing of these reports just to make sure they're sufficient for what type of project is being proposed. Here's the map I mentioned. This shows you the two most commonly reviewed geohazards, which are erosion prone and landslide hazard areas. And you can kind of get an idea of where these are from the map. They're mainly along the hillsides of West Hill and Lee Hill. So typically obvious areas. Okay, next item here is critical aquifer recharge areas, or CARAs for short. As planners, we like to shorten things. The goal of establishing these CARAs is essentially to protect the community's drinking water by preventing pollution and recharging groundwater. In Auburn, there are two types of CARAs, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 being the more restrictive of the two, and these are shown in the different colors on the maps. Those different colors being essentially how long groundwater needs to, or how long it would take groundwater to reach those wells or water areas. So in type 1, the restrictions generally preclude certain land uses, such as storing hazardous materials or substances. But they also replace the placement of septic systems, like for a single family residence, unless they are in the rural residential conservancy zone, which is mainly in the southeastern portion of the city, and they don't have any access to public sewer. And then those septic systems also require some additional engineering as well to ensure the water source is protected. Type 2 is the rest of the areas in the city, shown on this map as the white areas, and they only require the property owners or business owners to implement best management practices for groundwater protection. So pretty generic. There are different types of water wells that are located within or near to the city, including not only City of Auburn wells, but other cities, and other public agencies, and also private community wells. On the next slide, I'll show you a map of the city along with all of those different well locations. And then lastly, similar to geotech reports, planners, we review these CAR reports, but for these, we lean heavily on the expertise of Lisa and Susan, who you just heard a presentation from, for their technical analysis on those. Here is the map that I mentioned. This shows the different Group A water purveyors who have wells in or near the city. So you can see there's obviously a number of city-owned ones. There's also some private ones, and then other cities that have them pretty close to us as well. And just a Group A water system is generally a water system that has at least 15 service connections. So you may have remember seeing this map when we did that critical areas update back in 2018. You know, some of you were on the council then. So, all right, lastly, I'll talk pretty briefly about wildlife habitat. In the city here, wildlife habitat protection is mostly relating to fish, salmon, you know, for obvious reasons. However, there are some areas of elk habitat in the southeastern portion of the city. You can see as the crosshatched areas in the bottom right of that map image there. We have, there are 3 types of habitat protection areas. There's critical, secondary, and tertiary. The critical area or critical habitat areas include the green and white river corridors, category 1 wetlands that I mentioned previously, nesting sites, and then other areas that are known to be used by endangered or threatened species. Secondary habitat areas, those are the ones that support other critical areas. So in the city, it's mainly wetlands, what we'd be calling the secondary habitat. And then as it says there, tertiary habitats, these are features such as open spaces and parks, stormwater ponds, and those type of things. And also, as I mentioned to the right here, those elk habitat areas these are from the Department of Fish and Wildlife priority habitat inventory maps. So again, development in those areas may require more site-specific studies to determine what might be, what type of habitat might be out there. And with that, it's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd love to try to answer them the best I can. And then as noted, or as I mentioned, the next presentation will be on the Shoreline Master Program coming up in middle of August.
Thank you, Daniel. Do we have any questions?
Councilmember Trent Manuel's raised her hand.
Councilmember Trent Manuel.
Yes, I had a question on page 57. You have a map there with all the green. Now it says that the green are landslide hazards. How often do we keep an eye on that? And which ones are some of our most concerns, if we have any?
I'm trying to get that packet open back up. I closed it on my end, but I know the map you're talking about. Yeah, so any development that comes in, we're going to be looking at that. You know, there's so many different people on our staff that look at these, so it doesn't get missed. And then we have a standard setback from like a steep slope, which is a minimum of 15 feet. And then they'll have a geotech report that they'll have to have done that says, okay, is that 15 feet, that minimum 15 foot okay? Or does building foundation need to be set back 35 feet instead of 15 feet? So yeah, we look at all that. And as I mentioned, our development review engineers, you know, they're all professionally licensed. So they're, you know, good.
I have an area that I have been kind of keeping an eye on, and that's the one that you go up Lee Hill and those apartment complex. Some of that hillside, you've got it all covered with grass, but there's bumps, and to me, it looks like sometimes it's really close to coming down, or is that just the way that it looks?
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard to say. Some of those hillsides, like for the apartment complex, those actually may not be native slopes. They may be engineered. So they were designed, as long as they remain vegetated and aren't altered, that they're designed to look like that. I don't know if that's the case with this particular one, but it could be.
Okay.
One thing that I would add on that is that I think Daniel alluded to this, but these maps, we use them as a regulatory tool to evaluate future development. We don't, as a city, go out and monitor private property and the stability of slopes on private property. Not until they approach us, the property owner, do we start evaluating the condition of the slope. But the private property owners have a responsibility as well to monitor and manage land, and land moves. There's no question about that. So that is something that from an insurance perspective, they would be monitoring too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember when my family, we lived up behind the casino on Scenic Drive, overlooking the Highway 18 and the Green River. There was a huge chunk of property that went down and trees rolled down, and we decided it was time to move. But that's Mother Nature. Are there any other questions? If not, I have one. So Daniel, I mean, I really like that slide you had about the the width of the buffers and looking at the Wisconsin graph. And I'm just wondering, it sounds like we as a city or we as a council, we set those buffers. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so is this something that you're interested, or we as a city might be interested in doing, in terms of re-examining the buffers and seeing if they need to be updated?
Our current buffers that council updated in 2019, that is the most current recommendations from Department of Ecology. And if you want to change those buffer widths to anything less, then essentially you have to create your own best available science.
Right. Now I'm thinking of extending them more.
I mean, the council could always look at that. It just becomes you'd have to look at, is that really fair for, someone trying to build a house or a developer? Is it equitable for the width of that buffer as a relation to, how big the property is or what have you?
Right. I mean, that seems to always be the issue for, the environment versus economic development. I mean, they get balanced out way. So, but that's, okay, it's good to know council looked at that a couple of years ago.
Well, and I'll add to that when council is evaluating that, of course, that goes to the planning commission and it comes from a staff recommendation, but all of that is based upon state agency guidance and best available science. Daniel talked about best available science earlier. We have an obligation to update these critical area regulations periodically under state law. That time frame is established in state law. So while we can certainly do things at a different pace or a faster pace or more frequently, the evaluation of critical areas and best available science, we're lucky in the state of Washington because Department of Fish and Wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, and the Department of Ecology are accumulating and tracking best available science. And that comes in the form of lots of scientific reports that are prepared. The graph, I too agree, Councilmember Stearns, that graph from Wisconsin is a really cool one. It tells a lot in one piece of paper, one slide. So it's really cool to be able to see that. The state agencies provide Auburn as well as all the cities in our region with what the science is, what the best science is. And we really give a lot of credence to that. And it's for that reason that the city of Auburn, the city of Kent, the city of Federal Way, go down the list of cities, we all tend to adopt the same set of standards or very close to the same set of standards in order to create, in order to follow best available science and have a fairly level kind of playing field, I guess, in the region as well. So I think that's another couple of important points with respect to your question.
Thank you very much, Director. Do we have any other questions before my race is run and we we turn it back over to the Deputy Mayor? If not, I just thank you, Daniel. Really great presentation, and thank you, Jeff, for I'm just so grateful for the work that you guys do, and the importance that Auburn places on the environment. So thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
All right. I think Councilmember Stearns, you did a nice job and you ran a good race. Okay, now we're down to the end. So Council, any other discussion items this evening? Is there any new business to cover? All right, very good. We are adjourned. Everybody stay safe.